Senator is trying to help domestic violence survivors.
Officials say in the past few years, they've had to turn away thousands of requests for shelter. Channel 8's Mackenzie Johnson joins us now with the latest details on our top story tonight. Mackenzie.
There's a shortage in housing available to victims of domestic violence across the state. Some think there's not an immediate solution for the problem.
It's a huge concern for us.
Last year in Nebraska, 7,500 requests for help couldn't be met for domestic violence survivors. For some of them, a lack of resources could have meant they had to return to life with their abuser.
Economic security is the single most important factor for most survivors of domestic and sexual violence to finding safety and moving forward. And housing is arguably the most important piece of that. So for survivors that need to access safety immediately from someone who's harming them, the inability to get into shelter can have really a long-term effect.
McTaggart is the executive director of the Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, which helps provide shelter in all 93 counties. She says the amount of survivors who need shelter has stayed pretty stable, but the victims have begun to stay longer in order to get on their feet.
Because we have seen a housing crisis in Nebraska around finding affordable housing or finding housing at all, that it doesn't appear that there are a lot of really immediate solutions.
If there's no room at a shelter, the survivor will be placed on a waiting list. McTaggart says there are a couple things that could help.
More long-term public assistance programs for housing outside of our network, which are longer term. They are struggling with staffing shortages.
Along with the need for more staffing, she says some survivors are restricted from services if they don't meet criteria, like being a former felon. She says changing those regulations could help. Because of this problem, Nebraska Senator Wendy DeBoer is doing an interim study on the lack of housing. Of course, we'll be keeping you updated as that continues.
All right, Mackenzie, appreciate the report tonight.